Alright, so in After Effects you have a few different ways to import files. The first one being we can go up to File, Import, and import a file or multiple files. If we're in the Project Panel window, we can right-click, go to Import, and we'll get the same options. Another way is by simply double-clicking inside the Project Panel window. A window will pop up, and you can navigate to the files that you want to import. Right now I have a series of images that I've collected into a folder called Public Domain Stock Images. We can click on this one, for example. If we just want one file, we'd hit Open. For this case, I will import a few different files, so I'll hold Command and click on the ones I want to bring in. Or we can simply, if they're in a row, we can click the top one, hold Shift, just like as if you're on your desktop working with multiple files. Once those are selected, we go to Open, and as you can see in the Project Panel window, all of the files have been imported, and they are still selected. Just like on your desktop, you can create folders and create an organized folder structure. So let's click on it, press Enter, and name it Images. Inside the folder of Images, we will place all our imported files. So let's click, hold Command, select all our files, and then place them inside Images. The last one here, Images. Okay, so now we have all of the images that we imported into After Effects organized nicely into a folder. The first thing we want to do is bring in a new image into our composition once a composition has been created. So I've created a 1080p composition, which is right here. So we double click it, it brings us into this blank composition. I will bring in an image that I like, or a piece of footage. Now we have a white background, but I would like this to be scaled to full screen. So I will hit S on the keyboard. I will scale this a little past the full screen mark. We can go to Layer, New, Camera. We will keep the preset to 35. We will click OK. Everything else is fine for now. Now, until this layer turns into a 3D layer, the camera will not be able to control it. So on this layer, let's turn it into a 3D layer. And now the camera will be able to control the layer. We can go down into the drop menu here, inside Transform, and on the position layer, we can see that the right side starts moving to the back, or if we go the other way, the left side starts moving to the back. Let's undo that, Command Z, or we can go to Orientation and click this, for example, and move it to the left or move it to the right. Now it's important to understand that this is the actual camera, a virtual camera, moving around and not the image. For example, if we go to the Z rotation and click and drag, the image appears to start rotating. It's important to understand that the image is actually not rotating, it's the camera that's rotating. Much like if you held a camera handheld and started rotating the camera, the image produced would be spinning. Okay, let's Command Z and undo that back to the original. And from here we can create a simple animation. So on the position, we will click on the stopwatch, which creates a keyframe. On the left side here, we will click and drag until the edge of the screen, which we can see right here. If we go a little further, the white is introduced, so we want to hide the white. And if we click and drag and place our timeline cursor at the end of the composition, and then click and drag the other direction until the white is shown, and then go back a bit, then over time the image will appear to be turning in 3D space. Okay, so the next thing we can do is add a fake camera movement to the image. So we have an image file brought into a composition. We can go down into the Transform section, and under the Position property, we can, on a Mac, Option click, or on a PC, Alt click the stopwatch here, which opens up the section where you can type or copy and paste an expression. So for now, we can delete what is there. We can type in WIGGLE bracket 1, comma 20 close bracket. Now this is a very standard expression, and basically what it does is it moves the image around randomly a certain amount of pixels over a certain amount of time. And it looks like this. We can exaggerate it by changing these numbers here. So we can go, for example, 5 for the second number and 20 for the first number. And it's almost like an earthquake. So this is cool for adding an earthquake type effect to footage you have or photos. For our purposes, we're looking for a simple camera shake, as if we were holding the camera handheld. So 1 and 20 works for us. We can even go a step further in adding a bit of rotation, as if the camera is swaying a bit from left to right as your shoulders move when you're standing and holding the camera. To do that, under the rotation property, we option click the stopwatch. We remove the text by clicking backspace. We type in WIGGLE bracket 1, comma 2 close bracket. Now this will add a slight bit of rotation randomly to the clip over time. So that mixed in with the position expression will produce a nice handheld feel to a single shot that otherwise had no movement. If you feel that that is too much, then you can always reduce it by going to 0.5 for the first value and 1 for the second one, for example. Or if you prefer even a little less, you could do 0.5 for the second one and go back to the original position and change the second to 10. Let's press 0 and check that out. So that's a little more subtle. And that is how you can add an expression to the position and rotation properties to give a random camera shake feel to your footage or photos. Just remember, you need to scale it a little larger as the camera moves around. Otherwise, you might reveal the edges beyond your picture or footage. Okay, so let's get started. Let's go to Composition, New Composition. We will select a preset that we want to work with. I want to work with 1080p, so we will click OK. We will make a new layer. We'll make it the comp size. We will press Enter and call it background. We will then create a new layer, text. We will type text effect. Then we will go to our selection tool. We will drag it to the middle. And over here we have our effects and presets panel. If you do not have this panel, you can go to Window and check it on. So up here is a search bar. If you know what you're looking for, you can type it in there. If not, you can go through the list and find stuff. For me, I know I want a drop shadow, so I will type in drop. And if we go down the list, we can find drop shadow right here. So what we'll do is we'll click it, drag, and do you see the difference of this will be applied to the text, this will be applied to our background layer. So what we want is on the text. Or we can drop it on the actual layer down here if we want. Over here we have our Effect Controls panel. This is where we make changes to our effects in After Effects. So right now we have one effect on this text layer called Drop Shadow. And it has several different settings inside that can be changed. We can change the color. For example, if we want it red, we can see there's a slight red drop shadow now. We can make it 100% so it's not transparent at all. It's more of a border. We can change the direction of it so it sits off the top left or goes to the bottom right. We can change the distance from 0 all the way up to wherever we want to go. And we can change the softness or spread of the text. So for me, I normally leave that at 0. I put this about 3, and I leave it at black. So it looks more of, just gives a little bit of pop to the text. Welcome back to this After Effects training course. In this lesson, we will discuss how to optimize After Effects. Okay, let's get started. Let's go up to After Effects CC. Let's go to Preferences. Click on General. Now this is our Preferences panel. This is very similar to what you'd see in other programs. It has specific options that you can change to customize it to how you want to use the program. So the first thing we're going to do is go into Previews, and we're going to set it at about 1/4 or 1/8 depending on your computer. I am using a 2.8 gigahertz 8-core Mac Pro with 26 gigs of RAM and a 1 gig graphics card. So for me, these settings work. So I set it at 1/8, and my GPU information is set to 700 megabytes. Now typically what you want to do is set your texture memory to about 70% of what your graphics card memory total is. So mine is 1 gigabyte, so I set it to 700 megabytes. That's 70% of my 1 gigabyte graphics card. Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back. In this lesson, we will be discussing how to actually animate and move the text layer around so that at the beginning it starts here, and at the end it's there. So in order for us to do that, we need to set certain points and tell After Effects that we want it to start here and end here, and over time animate over to here. So let's get started. Let's put our cursor right at the beginning by clicking and dragging, putting it all the way to the beginning, or we can press Home on the keyboard. Same thing works with End to go all the way to this end. So Home. Okay, let's go to our text layer. Click on the two little arrows. We're inside the transform properties now. We'll go into Position, and we will click on the stopwatch. Now what that did is it created a keyframe at the very beginning of our composition. This keyframe is specific to where our text layer exists in the composition. Okay, so now let's press End on our keyboard, which brought us to the end of our composition, and we can click on our text layer, making sure it's selected, and drag it to where we want it to end. Now it could be up here, it could be here, or it could be wherever you want. So we're going to set it up to right here. Okay, so now let's go to the start of our composition by pressing Home on our keyboard. You'll notice that the text layer is now back at the beginning. So if we were to click and drag, you'll see that it slowly starts animating between the two until it gets all the way to the end. So that is the very basics of keyframe animation inside After Effects. Okay, welcome back. In this lesson, we will be making a motion graphic title. Okay, let's get started. In composition, 1080p, 10 seconds. Okay. Okay, we will create a new solid. It'll be light blue. Make comp size. Okay. We'll click it. We will press Enter, and we'll call this background. Enter. We will then create new text, and we will call this motion graphic. We will increase the size of this to around 100. We will then center this by going to proportional grid, and once again lining up the red squares with that line and these red squares with that line. we will center the anchor point, go back to the selection tool, we will turn off the proportional grid. So the next thing we can start doing is animating. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to go into transform, scale, make a keyframe, and then at the very beginning we're going to place it to 0. So what this does so far is it scales up all the way to there. Then what I want it to do is up until 9 seconds, I want it to slowly grow. So it'll just be about to there. And then from that point on, I want it to take off and zoom right past the camera. So what that's going to do is it's going to go all the way. It's going to keep going. And if you want, actually, you can hold Shift, and it'll speed up the grow much faster. All the way to that. So it just turns to black. So what we're going to do is we're going to select all the keyframes and make sure that there is no auto Bezier selected, which there is not, so we are good. We will make this one easy ease in. We will make this one easy ease out. So right now it goes like that, then it's slow grow, and then it goes shoo. So the way that looks, it's a slow grow for a few seconds, and then it zooms out quickly. Now the way the text is centered right now, it doesn't look the best for when it zooms out. So if we wanted to fix that, another cool way is you could go make a position frame there, and then at the end you could just move it to the right. And the way that looks is like that. It moves all, it's just a slow zoom in, and then it goes like that. So what we could do is you could even go a little further. Now if we click here and scroll out, we can see where it is now. So if we wanted, we could even make it go a little further, which would help with the animation. Okay, so let's go to fit. Okay, the next thing we can do is add a fast blur to our text. Turn on the keyframe, set it to 25, then move our timeline cursor to 1 second in. Change our fast blur to 0. Then we can go to the end and then open up the text, effects, fast blur, and then right here we can make another keyframe that's exactly the same as the last, and then we will go to the very end, and then we will set either down here or up here back to 25. So the idea is it starts out of focus and comes in, and then it leaves out of focus just a bit though, but because it goes so quick out of screen, it might make sense to do it right there. So let's move that off so the animation happens quicker for the fast blur. Okay, so if we want to exaggerate that, we can make this up to 100, for example. So it goes okay, so we can actually delete that, and here's another way to do that. So another thing we can do is use the After Effects built-in motion blur. So let's turn on the Master Motion Blur button, and then on the Motion Graphic text layer, let's turn on Motion Blur, and then we'll see here at the very end by we'll press 0 here, it adds some slight motion blur based on the keyframe animation on that layer. I like using the fast blur as opposed to the built-in motion blur inside After Effects, because with the fast blur you actually get a little more control and you're able to blur it as much as you'd like. Alright, that's it for this lesson, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Hey guys, how's it going? Thanks for joining me in this After Effects training course. My name is William Bartlett, and let's get started. First thing we're going to do is we are in After Effects CC 2015 right now. If you have an older version, it'll look pretty much the same. I think they added some color in the new one, but generally everything will be about the same, so you should be able to follow along. First thing we're going to do is go up to Composition, New Composition. In this panel box, we have a few different options. So composition name, this is what your composition will be called. So right now we'll call it Composition Test. We have a preset. I created this one, so we can start from scratch here. If you know you're outputting to 1920 by 1080, then you can go to HDTV 1080-24 and then just change a few things. So 1920 by 1080, that's correct. You can verify this by the aspect ratio being 69, which is widescreen. Your pixel aspect ratio is square, meaning it's as tall as it is wide for each pixel. That's what we want. Frame rate 24. Now, typically your DSLR will record at 23.976, so let's change that. Resolution full. Start time code, we'll keep that at 0 for now. The next thing we have is the duration. So right now it's set to 10 seconds. Basically what this means is your composition will be 10 seconds long from start to finish. The first one here is frames, seconds, minutes, and so on. Right now it's 10 seconds, we'll leave it at that. Hey guys, and welcome back to this After Effects training course. In the last lesson we discussed animating a text layer from the top right to the bottom left using 2 keyframes. In this lesson we will be digging a little deeper into keyframe animation. Okay, we can see that we have a keyframe at the beginning and a keyframe at the end. We can scrub through this roughly in the middle, and the text is in the middle roughly, but there is no keyframe there because it's just animating between the two. If we wanted this to, for example, start at the top right and do more of a curve to get to the bottom, the way we do that is by clicking the text and then bringing it up like that. And you can see just by creating 3 keyframes, we can create a much more interesting curvy flow. So let's see what that does. So let's do that. It goes up and then it heads back down. Okay, so we can click on this one, or we can click on this one, and it'll change which keyframe we are working on. So for now we will click on this one, and you can see that we can actually click on this long line here, which will change the curvature of the animation on the one side, and we can do the same thing on the other side. And we can kind of fine tune how we want to animate this. I'm going to undo that to keep it how it was. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is add some rotation to this. So let's bring our timeline cursor to the beginning again, to the start of our composition. We will click on rotation, we will add a keyframe. It hasn't done anything yet because our rotation is still set to 0. We've just created a keyframe at 0 rotation. Okay, so let's go to our center here, and a good way to know that you're on this keyframe is by looking over here. It'll be blue. When you're off of it, it doesn't light up. When you go over it, it does light up. Okay, so we click on the bottom layer here. Okay, so now we will go to rotation while it's selected and click and drag and turn it upside down to 180 degrees. Then at the very end, by pressing end on your keyboard, we will continue rotating until we hit 360 degrees, which means we've completed a full circle. So if we go back to home and scrub through it, you'll notice that it'll do one entire full rotation along our animation keyframe points. Now this can be done to pretty much everything in After Effects. Almost everything has the ability to add keyframes to it. So for example, scale, we can turn the scale on We can set it to 125. We can go to the beginning, place it back to 100. We can go to our end by pressing end on the keyboard, sending it back to 100, pressing enter. And then if we go through it now, it scales a little bit and then goes back down. So to exaggerate that, we'll go here. We'll make sure we're on the keyframe. If we're here and we do it, it'll create a second keyframe, which we do not want because that will create bad animation. It could be choppy or it just won't look good. So what we can do is we can click on the keyframe and click delete on our keyboard, or we can just simply Command Z to undo. Let's put our cursor on top of the keyframes we have in the center, make sure they're lit up. That means we are above them. And to exaggerate it, we'll click and drag and make it pretty big. We'll go home on the keyboard and then we'll click and drag, and you can see it gets much larger and then it goes smaller again. So very smooth animation all the way from the beginning to the end. Okay, now let's go over to media and disk cache. Now we want to make sure that that is enabled. We should set it to a hard drive that has at least 100 to 200 gigabytes free on it. And I normally set this to about 100. You can set it to more if you have a larger hard drive, but 100 seems to work fine. Over the years working as a visual effects supervisor, I've noticed a lot of people do not empty the disk cache, or they don't clean the database of cache on their system. The result of this can be hundreds and hundreds of gigabytes taking up space on your hard drive. These are temporary files, and After Effects will create new temporary files when you open it up again. So if you are constantly creating After Effects files, I would recommend that every month or two you go into the preferences and empty the disk cache. For me it's 2.1 gigs, so I will wipe that and clean database. After Effects is very powerful and comes with many different effects and presets. For example, if we go into the animation presets, go to text, 3D text, you can see that there are literally hundreds. So if we click on 3D flip, apply it to our text layer, so we can see that over time each letter pops up in 3D. Let's Command Z to undo that. Another example would be slide. We can take slide drop, apply it, and then over time it'll drop in from the top. Now let's go into the composition panel at the very bottom. Now it's highlighted in blue. First thing you'll notice is there is nothing here. So we've created a composition, but we have nothing in the composition. We have no layers or anything. Okay, let's get started. So let's go to Layer, New, and Solid. This is similar to your composition panel. You name it. Right now it's set to Purple Solid 1 because the color is defaulted to purple. It is 1920 by 1080, which is the size of our composition. We can confirm that by clicking Make Comp Size. Units pixels, pixel aspect ratio square, that's exactly what we want. For our purposes, we can just make it pure white. Okay, now it looks like nothing has changed, but now we actually have something white. This will be rendered out. Alright, so there are a few other ways we can add some effects to this to make it look a little better. One way is creating a vignette around the outside of our frame to draw the attention into the middle. So to do that, we create a new solid layer. We make it black, go to OK. Then we go to the ellipse tool and we double click it. Now inside the mask here, it's already highlighted. We click on either subtract or we go to inverted. From there, we open up the tab and then we start moving around these parameters. Okay, so that's okay, and then we will go to maybe a little less. Do something like that. Okay, let's rename this vignette. And let's toggle it off and on so we can see what it does. Just adds a little bit of depth. The next thing we can do is add a hotspot in the middle. Let's do solid. Let's make it white. Let's go to OK. And then we'll do the exact same thing. Double click. But this time we don't need to invert it. We'll just open it up. And we can go all the way out to something like that. But this time mask expansion. We'll make it much smaller. And then we can start rolling that back until we get something we like. So that's okay for now. And then what we'll do is we'll place that, we'll click and drag it and place it below. And the vignette will be behind as well. Let's tweak some colors a little bit. Let's go to solid settings on the background layer and let's make it a nicer color. Okay, let's make the white solid slightly off-white, slightly into the blues a little bit. Okay, another thing we can do is go up here and type in flare, generate lens flare, and we will place it on our title. Now what this does when placed over a text effect is it creates a lens flare that only shows up inside the letters, and you can actually animate it from one side all the way through it. So this is a great way to have some light and change of color moving through your text. So the first thing we want to do is go to about there, place the flare center somewhere around here, somewhere along the bottom. And then as we animate across, the top part of the flare will pass through it. So we just have to try to find the sweet spot. So let's go up there, and that looks good. Okay, so we'll start there. Okay, we will turn on the flare brightness and the flare center. And then we will go to the very end. And then we will move the flare all the way across. And all the way to the top. So through the text it goes like that all the way through it. So let's go to the middle here. And we'll change the brightness to about that. Okay, so the next thing we'll do is we'll go to the beginning and we will watch it. Okay, and that brings us to the end of this lesson. We created a very basic motion graphic title. That is pretty much the starting point to all motion graphic titles, where you have some animation with a text file, you have some gradient colors in the background, and you have some sort of color change throughout the text. Alright, and in the next lesson we will see how to address the issue with the banding here that's going on in the background. The next thing we're going to do is go into the autosave panel. We'll make sure it's checked and turned on. We'll make sure it's set to save every 5 minutes and that it saves up to 40 versions. I highly recommend you set it up like this because this is a huge time saver, because in After Effects you tend to click a lot every minute. So you might even want to set it to quicker than 5 minutes and more than 40, but at least keep this as the minimum. What that means is you'll be able to go back to previous save points up to 200 minutes. The next thing is playing back. After Effects requires a lot of processing power to play back animation inside After Effects. So typically you'd have to render the After Effects project in order for it to play back smoothly. We can see underneath here that while we were scrubbing, it was rendering certain frames, but it didn't get all of them. This is how I like to set it up. If you're in an older version of After Effects, you won't need to change this because the default is number pad 0. The only thing you'll need to change is current time if you'd like to set it up how I do. Okay, so let's press home. We'll go back to the beginning. We'll press number pad 0, and it'll slowly render as we see the green bar going across. When it gets to the end, it'll start over again, and this is playing it now in real time because it's fully rendered. There is the animation, almost like a screensaver, showing our text layer animate, grow, rotate across the screen and end up in a different position. Inside After Effects, there are a lot of great effects you can choose from. For example, inside Blur and Sharpen, we can click and drag the fast blur onto our text. Then we can go into our Effect Controls panel, and we'll see that under the drop shadow we now have fast blur. And under the blurriness layer, we can click and drag to add blur to our layer. Now once again, this can also be keyframed. So for example, let's set it to 0. Click on the stopwatch, and then we'll go over to 4 seconds and put it to 50. So if we go into our text effect layer, drop down the arrow, go into effects, we now see that fast blur has a keyframe there and a keyframe right here. So at here it starts at 0, and as it goes it grows all the way up to 50. And that gives us a blurring effect over time. Hey guys, welcome back to another After Effects lesson. In this lesson we will be discussing how to create a lower thirds title. To get started off, let's go to Composition, New Composition. Let's select 1920 by 1080, our preset that we created in an earlier lesson. We'll go to OK. By default, After Effects resets the working space to none, so I prefer to work in the sRGB, so let's set that up. Alright. Okay, so right now we have no layers and our goal is to create a lower thirds title somewhere around here. So the first thing we're going to do is create a solid. We'll make it the color we want. That's fine. We'll make it comp size. Okay, so now we have a blue solid created. This will be the background color and shape of our lower thirds title. We can either draw it using the pen tool like in a previous lesson, or we can use a preset. For this example we will use a preset, so we'll click and hold, and we can choose the rounded rectangle. What we'll do is we'll click and drag and we'll make something that looks like that. We will go back to our selection tool. Now we will click here and drag it to the edge. This is the background now of our lower thirds. So what we can do is give it a little bit of depth by adding a drop shadow. We'll type in drop here up in the effects and presets search bar. We will take the drop shadow and drop it on this layer. We will increase the opacity to 100, increase the distance to 12, and the softness to roughly 10. Now if we click on nothing down here just to clear the selection, we will see what it's doing. Okay, so that looks okay. Next we will create a new text layer. This will be the name that appears on your lower third. So we will type in the name. We will roughly bring it down. We went back to the selection tool, and then we clicked it and we brought it here. We will go into our character. We will click and drag to lower it. We will click and drag it so it goes there. We can change the font color to something that fits better. For now, we'll just make it black. Next, we will create another text layer, and this will be the subtitle in our lower thirds. So we'll call it AE Training. We will click and drag here. We will lower this. And maybe we'll line it up on this side. Okay. First off, I'm thinking that this could be changed a bit. So what we'll do is we're set to 41% zoom right now. We'll go to 33, so it shrinks a little bit so we can see the edge of this stuff here. What we'll do is we'll actually click on one point, so it sets it up in this selection state. Then outside, where there's nothing to select, we click and drag, and we're only going to select those points so that the bottom 4 are selected but the top 4 are not. Then we will click and hold, then hold shift, and we will drag up so that it all moves at the same time. And we will shrink it. Then we will click away, then click again on one of these. So we're in this selection state again. Then we will click here, hold, select them all so that these 4 are selected and these 4 are not selected. Then we will click and hold, and again hold shift and then drag left. Then we will click on nothing down here, and we have reduced the size of our background. Now it looks like the top part could come down a bit, so instead of adjusting the background again, what we can do is just select both these text layers and move them up a bit. So what we'll do is we'll click AE Training, hold shift, and click on this text layer. And then using the up and down arrows, you can actually adjust by a pixel every single time. So let's go 2 pixels. Okay, that looks good. And then what we'll do is on the back here, we'll press enter and call it lower thirds background. After that, what we'll do is we will parent both the top layers to the background layer, and then we will lock the top 2 layers so that if we tried to grab this or this layer, we wouldn't be able to. So the only thing we can edit now is this. But the great thing about this is if we select that and move, the other layers follow it. So it's like they're one layer because we've parented them. So I'm going to Command Z that. So it goes back to the original spot. I'm going to move them off screen a bit. And that looks good to me. So now we're going to start some animating. We will then go into Transform. We'll click on the stopwatch for position. We'll go over to 4 or 5 seconds. And we will then click up here and hold. Then hold shift so that when we drag it, it follows the same line. And we'll go out just a bit. Then we will go to 5 seconds. And once again, we'll click and hold shift, and drag it completely off screen. Then we will go to the very first frame and do the exact same. Click and hold shift, drag it off screen. So now we have the first keyframe starts off screen. The second one goes to the first position we made. Then it slowly moves right to the third keyframe. And then the fourth keyframe, it animates backwards off screen again. Sometimes in After Effects, the animation does not work exactly how you want it to, even if you have only 4 keyframes and it seems to be animating where there aren't keyframes. The reason behind this is the keyframe interpolation. And the way to fix this is you highlight all of them, you right click on one, go to keyframe interpolation, and where it says auto Bezier, switch it to linear. Now what will happen is it'll go like this, and then it'll slowly move right, and then it'll disappear again. So that's exactly how we want it to animate. In the first year or two of After Effects, I used to actually delete the layer and start over if this would happen, because I did not know why it was happening. I thought it was a glitch. I'm hoping that in the future After Effects fixes this, but for now the solution is keyframe interpolation and make sure nothing says auto. So that's it for this lesson. I'll see you in the next. Okay guys, let's get right into it. So banding occurs when you have low bit depth or when you just have colors that just don't blend properly. So for example, here we're seeing a whole bunch of banding lines as the color changes to the white. Alright, so there's a few ways we can address these issues, and the first one is the bit depth. So in here we can simply up the bit depth to 16 or 32, and that should help with the banding a little bit. However, it sometimes introduces other problems, such as certain effects only work with 8-bit. So instead of doing that, let's set it back and we'll fix it another way. Let's go to Layer, New, and Adjustment Layer. An adjustment layer typically sits above another layer where you add an effect to it, and that effect affects the other layers below it. So let's go over here and type in grain. Let's add grain to the adjustment layer. We will change the viewing mode to final output. Then we will play around with the intensity until we're happy with it. So right now it's a little too much, so we can go down to 0.3 maybe. Because movies are created using cameras, cameras tend to have grain in them already. And so our eyes are naturally accustomed to seeing grain. So I would recommend adding grain to every After Effects project you work on. Don't overdo it, but 0.1, 0.2 on the intensity, or 0.1 or 0.2 on the size will just give it a little bit more raw, real feeling to the motion graphic that you created. Now let's explain a few things at the bottom here. So this is one layer. We can click that and we can scrub through the timeline. You'll see on the side here that our counter is going up. Right now we're at 1 second and 22 frames. If we go over to here, we're at 5 seconds and 21 frames. This is our timeline from the end all the way to the beginning. That's what will be exported. Okay, so this is our name, which is up here. This is the file that was created. Everything that you create gets stored in the project panel. So solids by default get put into a solids folder, and then it was placed down here. So we have a few different options here. We can lock the panel, which means we can't do anything with it. So that's great if you're animating a whole bunch of things and you don't want to move this layer by accident. We can solo this layer, which means if we had multiple layers and we only wanted to see this layer, we'd click on solo, and then that would be the only layer that shows up. Okay, the next thing is we have some animation boxes over here. So the first one is a 3D box. If you click this, it'll enable this layer as a 3D layer, and then in the tab here you'll have a whole bunch of other options for rotating and spinning in 3D. The next important thing for you guys to know is motion blur. If you click on that, that means you're enabling motion blur on this layer, but in order for this to be turned on, you actually need to turn on the master, which is right here. Enables motion blur for all layers. So with that on, you turn it on for that layer, and then this white solid 1 layer will now have motion blur, and that will be seen if we do some animation. For now, we'll turn it off. The next thing is working around in your timeline. So the workspace here is the blue from the right to the left. That is, again, what will be exported. Below it is the layer in the red here. So if we go here, that means that at the beginning there will be nothing, and then all of a sudden it'll turn on. Same with the end, for example, and nothing. So I'm just going to undo that, Command Z. Okay, now we're back to where we were. We have a white solid that fills up the entire composition from 0 to 10 seconds. Hey guys, welcome to the next lesson. Let's get right to it. Let's go to Layer, New, Solid. We will create a red solid layer. We will name it Red Square. It will be the same size as the composition. To verify that, again, we can click on Make Comp Size. We want square pixels and units as pixels. That's all fine. We'll click on OK. Now, because this layer is at the very top, that's all we see. So what we can do is we can move it to the middle if we want our text layer to show up above. Okay, so we have this created and it fills the screen. Now, let's say we wanted to create just a little box or a line, for example, that sits underneath. Well, that's easy to do. What we can do is we can actually go back into the layer solid settings, and we can actually change the height to 200 pixels and the width to, let's say, 400. That's what it'll look like. Okay, so, or we could do width 800 and height 50. Or we could do height 10 to make a thin line. So let's go with that. With it selected, we can go here, click on it, and drag it to where we want it. So now it's sitting underneath. And we have just created a separate layer from our text layer and a separate layer from our background white layer that can be animated individually. Now it'll have the same properties as our text layer. You go to Transform, we can create a keyframe, go to here, and we can pull it all the way to there, and we can hit a rotate and rotate it by that, then go back to the beginning and reset the first keyframe to 0. And then without selecting the layer, you won't see the animation path, so you can follow it a lot better. It's far from professional, but it's interesting nonetheless. Let's create some text. So let's go to Layer, New, Text. By default, it'll create an empty text layer. Without clicking anything, you can start typing. So let's go Test, Layer. Okay, we will click up here at the very top, Selection Tool, which is your main tool in After Effects. For now, we will drag it over, click and drag. We'll put it in the center. Okay, so you'll notice we now have two layers. The text layer is on top. If we were to put it below, it would hide because the white solid is covering it. So just like Photoshop and other similar programs, After Effects works with layers that are stacked above each other. So the top layer is the one that's on top. This is exactly like a bunch of pieces of paper, where you have the very bottom piece of paper down here and the very top. So if you're above it looking down, the white solid on top is the one you see. So if we want the text layer to be on top and that's the one we want to see, we do that. And because it's only this big, we see the white layer behind it. For example, if we went to the white solid here and turned off the eyeball, we would see nothing but our text layer. So let's turn that back on. So in our text layer, if we go to character on the side here, and by the way, if you don't have any specific panels, you can find that by going up to Window and then turning on whichever ones you need. So for example, if you don't have the text panel, which is called the character. You can click Window, go to Character, and turn it on. So if you'll notice, this layer is now selected. That means that it is editable. So we can click over here in the character panel where we change fonts, and we can press the up or down arrow to cycle through different fonts. Now this is a great tip for you to be able to quickly test out which fonts you'd like to have in your After Effects project. So let's go to just something basic for now. Let's go to Arial. Okay, and then we can go to, let's say, bold. This is very similar to other programs. You have, italicize, different size, font, and a whole bunch of other stuff. You can add strokes to the outside. You can raise the text. You can lengthen the text. A whole bunch of stuff. So let's Command Z. Let's click and drag and bring this to the center roughly. Okay. So let's say we needed to have this placed right in the center. A good way to do this is by clicking this part here and going to Proportional Grid, and then you'll be able to use the squares that surround the layer itself and center it by using this line and line it up with the red squares, and using this line and line it up with the red squares. So that is centered, so we can turn that off. Okay, with the layer selected, we can go over here to the character panel, click on the color, and make it a color such as that. Now you'll notice that there's a black outline. That is because there is a 2-pixel stroke over the fill. Fill means it is filled with a color. So we can either exaggerate that by going to 6 or 10, but for now we'll just keep it at 0. The next area we want to check out is memory. I have 26 gigs of RAM installed in this system, and I've set it up so there's 5 gigabytes reserved for other applications. What that means is I have 21 gigabytes being used for all of the Adobe applications. 5 gigabytes will be used for things like going on the internet, for example. Alright, so that is how you optimize your After Effects to make sure you're auto-saving properly, to make sure you're using your installed RAM and graphics card properly, and also to make sure you're not using up too much space through system cache files. Hey guys, welcome back to this After Effects training course. This lesson will be on easing in and easing out to make smoother keyframe animations. Okay, so we have an animation that goes to the right and then goes back to the left. So in order to smooth this out a little bit, what we can do is actually select this keyframe, right click, go to Keyframe Assistant and Easy Ease In, and then we can select this one and go to Keyframe Assistant and go to Easy Ease Out. That makes a specific type of keyframe that will smooth the movement of the transition from the fast movement to the slow movement over here. And this looks like this. So once again, just a slight change. It just slowly transitions into this movement. Okay, so let's say we want this title to show up for the entire 10 seconds. Let's grab those keyframes. Let's press the end key so we go to the end. We'll click and drag that all the way to the end. We'll make sure that lines up there. And we know it's lined up because this is blue again. So now we have a very slow transition, and what we'll do is we'll actually hit 0, and while it renders out, we'll watch this, and then as it gets to the end, it'll start over and we'll see the transition. So it's just a little smoother using the Easy Ease. Welcome back to another lesson here. Okay, let's get right into it. This one will be on pre-composing. Precomposing is when you have a composition inside another composition, or a sequence inside a sequence. Much like Premiere Pro, where you have a nested sequence inside your regular sequence timeline. Okay, so let's say we wanted to do some overall effects and graphics work to this entire piece. We could add some stuff to the adjustment layer to affect all the layers below, but there's another way that's a little more effective, that has a little more control, and that is precomposing. So what we do is select all the layers. We can either go down here and press Command A, or we can click one, hold Shift, and click the top. Then we can go to Layer, we can go to Precompose. Okay, so what we have here is a panel with a few different options. Up at the top we can name our precomp. I normally keep precomp in the word so that we can tell that this one will be inside our other composition. So let's call it motion graphic precomp. For this, we want to move all attributes into the new composition. We press OK. So we can see down here that we have a composition inside our comp1 composition. Okay, so now let's name comp1. So we'll go up here, we'll press enter, and we'll type in main. So now we know this is our main composition, and if we double click down here, it'll open up our pre-composition. So now we have two compositions, and this one sits in this one. And again, double click it, we'll open it up so you can edit the original composition. To create shape layers inside Adobe After Effects, we first need to have a composition open. So let's create a 1080p composition based off a preset we made in an earlier tutorial. Let's go to OK. Now that we've created our composition, if we go up to the Tools panel at the top, we have a few different options. The square right here, if you click and hold, will give you a few different presets of shapes. So for this one, we can go to the rectangle tool. Now inside our composition panel, we can click and hold and draw whatever size of a shape we'd like using the rectangle preset. So that is created. You'll notice down here that it's called Shape Layer 1, and it fills the entire composition. Now we can go back to our regular selection tool. We can go down into our shape layer. We can open it up, and you'll see there are a whole bunch of different options. So typically, the easiest way to start working with these and understand them is by clicking on Add and choosing a different option down here. For example, we can twist, and you'll see what it does just by default. We can open up the window down here and increase how much it twists by, as well as where it twists. And we can get some really cool results very fast just by changing a few properties. Okay, let's Command Z and undo those. Another option is, for example, pucker and bloat. So if we go into here, we can actually set it to a whole bunch of different numbers here and get as well some really cool results. So just like most things in After Effects, you can animate these as well. So let's go to Command Z, undo that. At the start of our composition here, we will click on the stopwatch to create a keyframe, and then we will bring our timeline cursor to the very end, and we will click and drag on the 10 parameter and turn it into that shape. So over time, as we scroll back to the start of our composition, you can see that it starts out with a rounded rectangle and turns into this cool shape. Alright guys, welcome to this After Effects training course. This lesson will be focused on creating compositions. Okay, so let's go up to our composition window inside After Effects. Let's go to New Composition, and let's create a few presets. So right now, we will delete the custom one. Okay, so what we can do is go to one of the Adobe presets. We'll click on HDTV 1080-24, and we will make sure it says 1920 by 1080, which it does. We will make sure that it has square pixels. That means that each pixel is as high as it is wide. Okay. The next thing is the frame rate. We want to make sure it says 23.976 or 29.97 or whatever your footage was shot at. So for me, I normally shoot at 23.976, so we'll go with that. The duration is 10 seconds. We can change that later if we wish. So let's create a preset by clicking here. We will name the preset 1920 times 1080 to 3.976. Okay, so now when we click on the preset, it'll be at the bottom here. That's if we're shooting in high definition at 2398. All right. Okay, so this would be a perfect example of where we would export this project using an alpha channel. So what we can do is go to Composition, Add to Render Queue. Okay, so we go to Output Module, make sure it's on 1080p alpha. Then we would go to Comp 1. This is where you name it and select the area where it saves. We would go to Work, Project, After Effects Training Course, and Finals. We'd call it Lower Thirds Title. We'd hit Save, and we would hit Render. Over here in the Test Layer panel of the text layer, we can click on the arrow and you'll get a few different options. Text and Transform. So inside Transform, you have the anchor point, which is the pivot point of the layer, and that is defined by this little piece here. Basically what that means is if you click on anchor point, it'll move around based on where this is. For example, rotation, it'll rotate around that anchor point. So I press Command Z there to get back to where we started. So for now, we'd like to center the anchor point to the middle so that the text rotates on its center, not on the side. So right now we have the anchor point locked to the bottom left corner of this text layer. And if we need this text layer to rotate, for example, click and drag here, we can see that it's rotating around that pivot point. All of the control happens around the anchor point or the pivot point. So Command Z to undo. So what we can do is go up here, click this tool, click and drag and place it roughly in the center. So now when we go to the rotation, it'll rotate around itself. Let's go back to our regular selection tool now that we've centered that. We can go to Scale and we can shrink the text or make the text larger. We can move the position of it, which is the same as clicking up here and dragging and moving it where we want. And then you'll notice here that now the anchor point is not set to 0 and 0 anymore. It's set to 393.6 and minus 36 to have it centered. With the opacity, it's set to 100%. That means you cannot see through it. If we set this to 50% and press enter, you would now see through a little bit. So now we're actually seeing a little bit of the white through the text. And that's why it got a little bit lighter. Let's go back up to 100%. Click enter. Okay guys, so that's your basic idea of what you can do inside the transform of a text layer. In our next lesson, we will explore keyframing and actually animating the text layer. Okay, so let's go to the main. Now on this layer, this is where we can start adding effects, such as color correction. For example, we can go up here to the effects, type in curves, drag it down, and just like a finished video file, this right here includes all of the layers in one layer, so everything will be affected. So let's go to our effect controls panel now that we've added the curves effect to this layer, and let's make some adjustments. So in the low ends here we can kind of darken it a little bit, and in the highs we can push it up a bit to give it some contrast. Okay, to cycle that, that's the difference. So that affects everything. Okay, so that's an effect we can do to add more contrast. Let's remove that. Let's say we wanted to remove some of the color. We could go to tint, drag it down. For now we will keep it at 100. We will turn on the stopwatch, which adds a keyframe. We can go to 1 second and 12 frames. We will change our amount to tint to 0. We will click on this layer and press U, which will bring up all of the keyframes on that layer. Right now we have 2. Okay, at 8 seconds and 12 frames we will create another keyframe that is the same as this one at 0. Then we will hit end on our keyboard to go to the end of our composition, and we will go up to our tint and put that back to 100%. Okay, so let's go to the beginning of our composition. Now, because there's a pre-comp and because we're adding effects on a composition that includes many layers inside that have their own effects, this can make your system a little sluggish. So in order to make it go a little quicker, we can go to our resolution here and set it to half, third, or quarter. For now, let's set it to third, and when we scrub through we should be able to see it a little more responsive than if it was set to full, which you can see it isn't working. Okay, so if we set to, let's say, a quarter, then it makes it a little easier to reference what we're doing, but there's a little bit of quality loss, as you can see, compared to full. Okay, so let's set it to a quarter. Okay, so we have our composition starting out in black and white here. As the text comes in, it changes the color. We then have our sun flare going through our text as our text grows a bit, and then as the text zooms out, it goes back to black and white. So that's a pretty straightforward effect using tint to give a cool little intro and outro. Welcome back to our After Effects training course. By the end of this course, you'll understand the basics of After Effects. You'll be able to start from scratch, create something, animate it, and export it. Okay, in this one we will be working with masks. So what we'll do is we'll click on our red square, we'll go into Layer, Solid Settings, we will make it the comp size, we will go to OK, and the reason we are not seeing it is because we have the position set to a far area. So what we can do is turn off the keyframes, we can click Reset, and then now it's back to its original position without any keyframes. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is, with our red square layer selected, we will go up to our pen tool and we will click until we've almost completed it, and then by clicking on the very first one we made, we will complete our shape or our mask layer. We can go now back to our original selection tool, and by clicking on any one of these little squares here, we can change the shape of it easily. Okay, so for now we can just make a rough shape here. Okay, so let's go red square, we'll open it up, we'll go into our masks now, because we now have a mask that is only showing this much of our entire red layer that we created. So inside the mask 1, these are our mask properties. So we can feather the edge, which means if we click and drag here, you can see we can get some pretty cool shapes like that feather out into the white. For now we'll keep it to 0. We can change the mask opacity from 100, just like our layer, down to 0, just like our mask layer. Or we can change the actual size of it by going into our mask expansion and reducing it or making it larger. The problem though is when we make it larger, it increases or scales the size of each corner, and that's why they are beginning to be round the larger you go. So if we did want to scale the entire mask itself without having the rounded edges, there is a way to do that. You click on mask 1 and then you press Command T. So what you can do is click on the edge here, hold Shift, and then you can actually scale it, and it'll be even as you scale. If you don't hold Shift, it'll follow the mouse. So let's hold Shift and let's make it a little larger. Okay, so that's done. We'll unselect everything by going down here and then go back into our mask, and now we're back to where we started, only the shape's a little larger. Alright, welcome back to this After Effects training course, and in this lesson we will be discussing animating masks. Okay, so inside our red square here we have a mask created with several different points. We will create a keyframe by clicking the stopwatch. You can verify that by seeing the little blue diamond here. If we go all the way to, let's say, 6 seconds and 3 frames, we can click over here and create a keyframe at exactly the same shape as this keyframe. Even though there are 2 keyframes, nothing happens because this keyframe has the exact same properties as this keyframe. So let's put our timeline cursor on that keyframe. We can see this by here. And what we'll do is we will click away, then click one of the spots and drag it. So now what happens is over time that one spot grows to over here. If we wanted a second one, we put the timeline cursor over that keyframe, make sure, then we drag that over there. So now over time both those grow. The next thing we're going to do is set our timeline cursor to the very beginning, and we can click and drag this one closer. So we can see that the animation happens much faster now because it's happening over only 1 second and 4 frames compared to several seconds. So now let's go to 2 seconds, and we will now take this point, move it there. We will take this point, place it roughly back where it was. We'll take this point, roughly where it was, and then we'll take that point and put it there. So now between those frames, it grows and then does that. Now let's make a 4K preset, so we'll go to 3840, and because we've checked this box, it'll stay at 16:9, which is widescreen, which is what we want, which is equivalent to 1920 by 1080. So 3840 by 2160 is a 4K resolution at 16:9 ratio. This is also known as UHD or Ultra HD. Pixel aspect ratio is square pixels, and again 23.976 is what we want. Duration 10 seconds, that's fine. So we will save this. 3840 times 2160 at 23.976. Okay, so if we go here, we can see both of those now. Okay, so in this lesson we will discuss how to use a mask to hide and reveal a text layer. So let's go into Motion Graphics Pre-Comp. Let's go to the middle so we can see our motion graphic text. We will select our motion graphic text, and while this layer is selected, we will go up to our pen tool and we can draw a rough box around it and then complete it by clicking the original point. Okay, let's go back to our selection tool. Right now we have an outline around our text, but it's not doing anything just yet. So with our text layer selected, let's hit MM on our keyboard. That'll open up the mask properties. Then click the stopwatch for mask path. That will create a keyframe right here. We will go back about a second or so. Then we will click one of the points here and hold, press shift, and then drag it away. So now basically what that's showing is over here we have the mask, but the text still exists here, but the mask is hiding it. So technically, if we turn the mask off to none, the text still exists there, but what we're doing is we've taken the mask and we've moved it away so you cannot see the text anymore. Okay, so basically because we've created two keyframes here, when we moved it over, it created another keyframe. So if we go across this, it'll start revealing. So okay, so that looks okay, but what we want is for it to happen the other way. So what we can do is we can highlight that keyframe, press delete to remove it, so now we have no animation. Okay, we can go back a second, and now because the mask isn't selected, meaning the points aren't little squares, we have to select all of them. So right now we've selected one, the other ones are just a frame of a little square, if you can see that. So if by selecting one we can select all of them like that, now it's ready to go like we were before. So click and hold. Let's try this one. Hold shift and drag it out this way. So now what that does is it reveals it left to right. So it's a little easier to read. Just to give you an idea of the different parameters you can do, if we set this to subtract, this is what happens. You see the text starting at the beginning, and then the mask actually ends up hiding it. So you can get really creative here with all these different ideas to come up with your own unique motion graphic. If you're ever working with 720p footage, it's very simple, the same thing. It's a 69 ratio. So width 1280 by 720. Square pixels, everything's the same, 23, that's fine. We'll go into the preset here. We'll call it 1280 times 720. And we'll call it 23.976 again. Okay, now we have three presets. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is click on the mask and press delete. So we're back to where we originally started with just our red square layer. Okay, let's select our pen tool, and this time instead of clicking, we will click and drag for each single point. We will end our mask by clicking here. And you'll notice that this time there are round edges instead of points. This is because we clicked and dragged and created these Bezier points. And if we were working in standard definition, we would uncheck this because typically standard definition is not widescreen. So we would change the width to 640, the height to 480. We would get a ratio of 4:3. Square pixels will stay the same. Frame rate can be 23976 or 2997. And we will save that. We will call it 640 by 480 at 23.976 and press OK. Okay, so those are your typical resolutions and how to create them. Welcome back, guys. Okay, in this lesson we will discuss how to parent one layer to another. What that means is one layer will control another. Okay, let's get started. So down here in the composition window, we can see we are working inside it now because it is highlighted in blue. If we click on the red square, we can see that we are working with this layer. We can go down to the transform layers and we can see all the properties here. Over here we have a section called parent. If we click on the pick whip of the top layer, which is the text layer, and parent it to our red square layer, what that means is the text layer will follow the red square layer. For example, if we click on position here and click and drag left to right, do you see how the text layer is following the other layer? Or if we rotate, the text layer is following just, or if we click on the rotation, it rotates together. That is because this layer is linked to the red square layer. This can be a very powerful feature because when you're working with several different layers, you could link them all up together to one main layer and have that as the controlling layer that affects all of them. In other words, you won't have to go through the dozen other layers and switch all the properties inside those layers to get it to animate how you'd like it to be. Alright guys, welcome back to this After Effects training course. In this lesson we will be discussing how to export your project. So first off, we need something to export, so let's go to Layer, Solid. We'll create a blue layer, and for now it's 10 seconds. That's all we need to do in order for it to export. So what we can do is click that. We can go to Composition. We can go to Add to Render Queue. In the bottom here, it has switched over to our Render Queue panel. This is where we export everything in After Effects. Here's the Comp 1 that we exported that has the blue frame. If you'd like to create a standard definition export, then what you do is have your composition set up with your images that you'd like to export. You go to Composition, Add to Render Queue. Under the Output module, we go to Make Template. We call this SD for Standard Definition Export. We can click on Edit. We go over to Format Options, Video Codec, and change that to H.264. And because this is standard definition, we do not need it to be very high. So if this were HD, we'd set it around 25 to 30,000. If this was 4K, it'd be even higher than that. But because this is standard definition, we don't need it set too high. So 8,000 will be fine for our purposes. Click OK. Now this is a 4K composition that we've created, so in order to make it standard definition, we need to change a few things. So we've already changed the bitrate to 8,000 kilobits per second. So the next thing we need to do is constrain the resolution to standard definition. So down here with the 16:9 checkbox selected for the aspect ratio, we can change the lower number to 480. And because of the aspect ratio being 16:9, a 480 composition will have the width of pixels being 853, which means it is standard definition widescreen. Okay, so we don't need crop and we can turn off the audio. Let's click on OK, go to OK, and we can see that our standard definition export preset has been selected. The next thing to do is go to Output, click it, navigate to where you'd like the export to go, navigate to where you'd like your export to go, give it a name. For this one we'll call it SD Export. Click on Save and go to Render. In the Output module, we will click on the arrow here and you'll see a bunch of presets that are already set up. These ones I created, so what we'll do is I'll show you how to actually create these. Let's go to Make Template. This panel will come up. Okay, so this is where we give it a name. We'll call it 1080p. We'll go into Edit. Format QuickTime is fine. Video output, channels, RGB, that is all fine. Format options. We'll change our video codec to H.264 because it's a pretty decent compression compared to Apple ProRes, but you may need Apple ProRes if you are exporting and need something that's lossless. For now, we will use H.264. We will limit our data rate 30,000 kilobits per second. Now, if you're working with a resolution of 4K, then you could go with 35,000, for example. If you're working with standard definition, you may only need this to be 8,000, for example. So we're working with 1920 by 1080, so we will keep it at 30,000. We'll click OK. To be safe, we will always resize it to 1920 by 1080. Custom and resize quality high. We do not want it to crop, so we'll keep that unchecked. And we do not need audio, so we'll turn it off. We'll go to OK, and then OK. Now, if we click the arrow, we will see our new preset created. Okay, so the next thing is, if you need, for example, a lower thirds title where the background needs to be transparent, because you're going to be putting it over footage inside another editing program, you're going to want an alpha channel. The way we do that is we click on Output Module, we go to Make Template, we call it 1080p alpha so that we know that this preset is the alpha channel preset. We click on Edit, and we cannot use H.264 because it does not support alpha channels. So instead, what we'll do is we'll choose the animation, or we can go to ProRes, but I typically use animation. We'll go to OK. Then we will go to channels, and we will choose RGB plus alpha. The RGB means the red, greens, and blues of your image, basically your lower thirds title, for example. And the plus alpha means it'll export an alpha channel, meaning a transparent background. If your After Effects project does include a transparent background, but you choose this, After Effects will not export a transparent background. Instead, it'll render out a black background and it's basically useless. So make sure that if you need a transparent background, you change it to animation or another codec that supports RGB plus alpha. The next thing is we want to make sure that resize is selected so that our preset is always 1080. We want no crop and the audio is off. So we go to OK. We call it 1080p alpha, and we click OK. To create a 4K preset or to render out your file in 4K, the first thing you want to do is make sure your file and your composition was created in 4K. So for this example, we will go to Composition, Settings, and this is currently set to 1920 by 1080. So we can switch this to 3840 by 2160. We can click OK. Now we have a 4K composition. We will click on our photo. We will press S to bring up the scale property, and we can scale it up to 4K. Now this is a pretty large photo, so we won't lose any quality. If you're working with 1080 footage, I would recommend exporting at 1080. Okay, so now that we have our 4K composition and our image scaled up to 4K, we can then go to Composition, Add to Render Queue. Now the file has been sent to our Render Queue section. Under the bottom tab here, we can go to Make Template. A window pops up and we can enter in our preset name here. So for this one, we will call it 4K Export, for example. We can click on Edit. Now we go into Format Options. Another window pops up. We can go to Video Codec and go down to H.264. We can limit the data rate. Because this is a 4K file, we would like to set this a little higher than we did in our 1080p preset, so we'll set it to 35,000. Now you can go higher than this if you'd like, but 35,000 seems to be a good bit rate for 4K footage. Click on OK. Make sure RGB is selected. We can make sure that it is exporting at 4K, so we will resize this and make sure it says 3840 by 2160. Okay, so now that we've resized this to 4K, we can go to the next section. We do not need the crop and we do not need audio. Let's turn that off and hit OK. Now we go to OK. At the bottom here, you will see that our 4K export preset has been created. The next thing we do is in the output section, we click it and we would navigate to our finals folder or wherever you'd like the export to go. You'd give it a name and then hit save. For this one, we'll call it 4K export. We'll click save and then we will render. It will take a lot longer than your HD footage because it is 4 times the size and resolution, so just be patient with the export.